I still hear that sound, the dull thud that split my life into before and after. I was standing there with the phone in my hand. Just one call could have changed everything. But I froze. I was afraid. I tried to convince myself it wasn't that bad. I left. I drove away, leaving behind a scream and silence. Now I'm in prison. And every day the walls remind me I'm not punished so much by the court as by my own silence. If this story resonated with your soul, click subscribe and let me know in the comments which city or country you're listening from. I'm truly curious to know where you're tuning in from. My name was Helen Parker. I was 43 years old, lived in Springfield, Missouri, and worked as an office manager at a small dental clinic just off West Sunshine Street. My life, if you could call it that, unfolded with a certain sterile rhythm, the kind that didn't leave room for drama and certainly not for accidents. Each morning I made coffee in a chipped blue mug, packed my lunch in a Tupperware box with the lid slightly warped from too many microwaves, and drove to work with the radio playing talk shows I didn't really listen to. My days were filled with insurance claims, appointment schedules, supplier orders, and mild gossip about whose kid got into what college. Since my daughter left for the University of Wisconsin the year before, the house had become a quiet container. Her room upstairs still smelled faintly of lavender lotion and dry shampoo. I kept the door open, maybe out of habit, maybe because the silence closed in tighter when it was shut. I didn't have many friends. I wasn't lonely, not exactly, but I'd gotten used to a solitude that coated everything like dust, unnoticed most of the time, but always there. That Friday, one of the hygienists at the clinic, Melissa, was celebrating her birthday. She invited the whole office to her sister's place, a modest ranch house on the edge of town, with a backyard that sloped into a shallow creek bed. I wasn't planning to go. I never did. But something about the evening made me say yes. Maybe I was tired of my own predictability. Maybe I just didn't want to sit in front of the TV eating leftovers again. I wore a cream-colored blouse with a faint stain near the collar that wouldn't come out, no matter how many times I treated it. I put on mascara for the first time in weeks. When I got to the party, the sun was just beginning to dip behind the line of trees at the edge of the property. The backyard was lit with strings of warm yellow bulbs and smelled of grilled meat and bug spray. Music played from a Bluetooth speaker on the porch. Fleetwood Mac, I think, and someone handed me a plastic cup filled with sangria almost as soon as I walked through the gate. It wasn't wild, just familiar, messy suburban joy. Paper plates, folding chairs, laughter that grew louder as the drinks went down. I talked to Melissa's husband about car troubles. I listened to two girls from reception complain about their boyfriends. I stood with my cup and watched the flicker of fireflies above the damp grass, the soft wobble of candlelight on picnic tables covered in store-bought cakes and half-eaten chips. I had a second drink, maybe half a third, not enough to feel drunk, just warm, relaxed. My shoulders loosened, my mouth unknotted. For a little while, I forgot about the unopened mail on my kitchen table, the noise the refrigerator had started making, the fact that I hadn't spoken to my daughter in 3 days. I laughed at a joke I didn't really find funny. I clapped along when they brought out a homemade cake shaped like a tooth. I said my goodbyes around 10, careful to smile and thank everyone, careful not to let the quiet that waited for me in my car spill out too soon. The night air had cooled, and the parking on that street was a mess, so I had parked 2 blocks away along a narrow side road that curled behind an elementary school. The headlights flicked on as I turned the key. The dashboard glowed its soft orange, the same way it always had. I turned on the wipers to clear the mist from the windshield. I was tired but not drowsy. Clear-headed, I told myself. I was fine to drive. The streets were mostly empty, just the occasional porch light and the faint whir of sprinklers coming to life. I took the familiar route home, the one I always used. I drove past the Walgreens where I picked up my prescriptions, past the Shell station with the flickering E in the neon open sign. I remember humming along to a song on the radio, tapping my finger against the steering wheel. Everything felt normal. I turned onto a narrow residential street with no streetlights, one I used as a shortcut to avoid the busier intersections. The asphalt there was cracked and lined with overgrown hedges. I knew the curves well. I had taken them hundreds of times. My foot barely touched the brake as I coasted through the dip between two sloping driveways. Then, something. A movement, sudden and out of place. A blur. A sound I didn't recognize until it had already happened. A thud. A sickening, muffled impact against the front of the car. The hood jolted. My hand seized the wheel. I slammed the brakes too late. Everything stopped. The engine idled in the silence that followed. The wipers kept swiping back and forth, useless now, rhythmically dividing the darkness. My heart thudded in my chest, a sound so loud I couldn't hear anything else. I didn't move. I couldn't. My breath came in sharp, shallow pulls. The car's headlights illuminated the road ahead, and for a moment I saw nothing. Just wet pavement, the gloss of rain, steam rising from the hood. And then, just at the edge of light, a shape. Still, slumped, human. I opened the door. My knees buckled slightly as I stepped out. The air smelled like wet asphalt and something metallic. I walked slowly, each step taking a year off my life. I reached the figure, a woman, maybe my age, maybe younger. She wasn't moving. Her groceries were spilled across the road. Cans, a plastic bag of apples, a crushed loaf of bread. One shoe lay 10 feet away. I crouched, but my hands didn't touch her. I was shaking. My phone was in my coat pocket. I reached for it, pulled it out, unlocked the screen. My thumb hovered over the emergency dial. My mind screamed at me, "Call, now." But I didn't press it. My eyes darted back to the woman, to the car, to the empty road. My thoughts blurred together in a rush of panic and dread. I told myself maybe someone else had already heard the noise. Maybe help was coming. Maybe she wasn't dead. Maybe if I just left, if I just kept going, no one would know. My thumb moved away from the screen. I stepped back, back toward the car. I got in. I drove. And as I turned the corner and the scene disappeared from my rearview mirror, I felt something inside me crack. Not loudly, not even visibly, but deeply, like the silent fracture of a foundation that no one notices until it's too late. At home, I sat in the car in the driveway for a long time, engine off, hands gripping the wheel until my fingers ached. The house lights were off. Everything was quiet. An ordinary evening. That's what it had started as. But nothing after that night would ever be ordinary again. It was strange how the world carried on. How, the morning after, the sky could still be blue and the birds could still sing like nothing had happened. I had always imagined that when someone's life changed forever, the world would look different, that it would darken, crack slightly at the edges, groan under the weight of what had been done. But when I opened my eyes that morning, sunlight spilled across the floor like it always had, casting a golden rectangle on the carpet by the coffee table. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. A sprinkler ticked in rhythm outside my window. And yet, nothing felt the same. I hadn't slept. I had laid in bed, fully clothed, my shoes still on, my hands pressed against my chest as if to keep my heart from fleeing. I listened to the silence of the house, interrupted only by the occasional creak of settling wood or the distant hum of the refrigerator. Everything had the sharp, cold quality of a dream you can't quite escape. My limbs ached from stillness. My throat was dry. I hadn't cried. I hadn't moved. I sat up slowly, the movement cracking something in my neck. My legs were stiff, my feet tingled as the blood returned to them. I walked to the bathroom in a haze, avoiding the mirror. I couldn't look at my reflection. Not yet. Not with what I knew was behind my eyes. The news came on around 8 a.m., the local station. I turned on the TV more out of habit than curiosity, the remote heavy in my hand. I sipped lukewarm coffee from a cup I didn't remember making. And then I heard it. A woman's voice, measured and professional, reading from a teleprompter. Springfield police are investigating a hit-and-run incident that occurred late last night in the Glenwood neighborhood. A pedestrian was struck while crossing Jefferson Avenue and was pronounced dead at the scene. Authorities are asking anyone with information to come forward. My hands went cold. The coffee slipped from my grip and landed on the carpet with a dull splash. I didn't react. I stared at the screen as they showed a photo of the scene. Yellow tape fluttering in the breeze, a crushed grocery bag, the heel of a woman's shoe abandoned near the curb. It wasn't graphic, but it was real. So painfully, unmistakably real. They didn't release her name yet, but I knew. I turned off the television and sat in silence. The world outside continued its mechanical rhythm. Cars passed, garbage trucks groaned and hissed, birds chirped. But inside me, there was only the echo of that sound from the night before, that hollow thud, that moment when time slowed down and my breath caught in my throat and the universe narrowed into a single, irreversible instant. I cleaned the coffee with a towel, though my hands trembled so violently I had to stop twice. The stain spread like a wound across the carpet, dark and wide and ugly. I didn't care. I left the towel on top of it and walked to the garage. The car sat in silence, bathed in pale morning light that streamed through the dusty windows. I opened the door and climbed in, pressing my fingers to the steering wheel. The seat was cold. I looked at the dashboard, the radio, the floor mats. My eyes drifted to the hood, to the faint curve I could barely see from this angle. I stepped back out and walked to the front. There it was, a crack in the headlight, a faint dent in the bumper, barely noticeable unless you knew to look. But I knew. I reached out and touched the cool metal, then pulled my hand back as if it had burned me. I wiped my palm against my jeans, even though it was clean. Panic rose in my chest like a tide. My body flooded with heat, my vision blurred, my heart thundered against my ribs. I stepped back, turned away, and leaned against the garage wall, trying to breathe. The scent of oil and old dust filled my nose. I felt like I was falling, even though I was standing perfectly still. I went back inside. I locked the door behind me. I showered in water that scalded my skin and scrubbed until my shoulders ached. I dressed in the softest clothes I could find, as if fabric could offer some kind of protection from what I had done. I curled up on the couch and pulled a blanket around my shoulders. I sat like that for hours, unmoving, unthinking, staring into the space where the coffee had spilled. The guilt came in waves. At first, it whispered. Then it roared. I tried to reason with myself. I hadn't meant to hit her. I hadn't seen her. It was dark, the street was poorly lit, and she had come out of nowhere. But that wasn't the part that haunted me. It wasn't the accident. It was what I did after. What I didn't do. I didn't stop long enough. I didn't get out. I didn't call 911. I didn't stay. I ran. I thought about the woman, about her groceries scattered on the street, about her last breath, about whether she was conscious after the impact, whether she waited for help that never came, whether she felt alone. I thought about her family. Did she have a husband, children, parents who would now receive a phone call that would tear their lives in two? I sat with these questions until they hollowed me out. I considered going to the police. I picked up the phone. I even dialed the first 3 digits. But something inside me seized. I hung up. I stared at the wall. I told myself I needed time, just a little time, to think, to breathe. The days passed like slow-moving water, thick, heavy. I stopped going to work. I told them I was sick. I stopped answering calls. I turned off my phone altogether. I didn't want to see her face in the news, but I couldn't help myself. I searched online. They released her name, Sandra Lopez, age 49, a nurse at the city hospital, beloved by patients and staff. Survivors, a teenage son, and an elderly mother. I clicked through the articles with shaking fingers. I looked at her photograph, a warm smile, tired eyes, a woman who had lived, who had mattered. The more I looked, the more I felt myself disintegrating. Sleep eluded me. Food tasted like dust. I began to imagine things, sirens outside the window, footsteps at my door, whispers through the walls. Every creak of the floorboards made my stomach drop. I dreamed of that street over and over, always arriving too late, always trying to call for help but finding my voice gone. One morning, I woke up on the bathroom floor, unsure how I got there. My lips were cracked, my head ached, and my fingers were curled into fists so tight I had to peel them open. I looked at myself in the mirror, really looked. My skin was pale, my eyes bloodshot, my face older somehow, as if the guilt had carved lines that hadn't been there before. I knew it couldn't last, that something would give, that eventually someone would knock on the door and call me by name, and I would crumble under the weight of the truth I had buried. But I also knew that whatever happened next, whatever punishment was waiting for me, I had already begun to serve it, in my own heart, in my own mind, because one moment, one hesitation, one fear-soaked silence had taken more than a life. It had taken who I used to be. The silence became a second skin. It wrapped itself around my body in the early hours of the morning, when the house was still and the world outside hadn't yet begun its daily rhythm of noise and distraction. It pressed against my ears when I tried to sleep, when I lay in bed staring at the ceiling fan, tracing slow circles in the dark. It followed me into the kitchen, into the bathroom, into the small square corners of my home that once held comfort, but now echoed with nothing. I had turned off the television. I had stopped listening to the radio. Even the hum of the refrigerator felt too loud. I couldn't bear the sound of anything that wasn't my own breath or the slow tick of the clock above the stove. Some nights I would stand beneath it, watching the second hand twitch forward, minute by minute, as if waiting for it to finally stop. It never did. I stopped answering the door. I stopped going outside. I watched from behind the curtain when the mail carrier walked up the driveway, slipping envelopes into the box with mechanical grace. The newspapers piled up near the porch, their headlines shouting truths I couldn't face. I let them sit there, a growing monument to everything I was avoiding, to everything I had done. I stayed inside because I couldn't face the eyes of strangers. I imagined them all knowing, cashiers at the grocery store, mothers at the playground, teenagers walking home from school. I imagined them whispering to each other in coffee shops, pointing toward my house, lowering their voices when I passed. I imagined their stares lingering too long. Their judgment was silent, but it was everywhere. My phone remained off, buried at the bottom of a drawer beneath old coupons and a broken charger. I couldn't bear the thought of a voicemail, of a message I hadn't prepared for. I couldn't hear my daughter's voice, not if it cracked, not if it was distant, not if it asked the questions I didn't know how to answer. She had texted me the week before it happened. Just a simple, "Call me later, Mom." I never replied. The thought of that unread message, sitting there like a living thing waiting to be acknowledged, made my stomach twist. The days stretched, elastic and shapeless. I cleaned the house obsessively, not to make it cleaner, but to exhaust myself. I scrubbed the same countertops again and again, wiped windows already spotless, vacuumed until the sound grated against my teeth. I washed the sheets even though I hadn't slept in them. I opened every drawer in the kitchen, rearranged forks and knives, tossed expired spices into the trash just to fill time. But no matter what I did, the silence remained. It seeped through the vents, crept under doors, curled into the corners of every room. At night, I sat by the window in the living room with the lights off, watching the empty street. A streetlight flickered across the way, sputtering now and then like it was unsure of its own purpose. Sometimes I'd see a raccoon dart across the yard, its eyes catching the dim light like sparks. Once, a car drove slowly down the block and paused near my house. I held my breath until it moved on. I told myself again and again that I would go to the police tomorrow, that I would walk in, say everything, hand over the keys, face whatever needed facing. But every morning, I found a new reason to wait, a new excuse. I told myself I needed to be sure, that I needed more time to think, to gather the right words, to explain it in a way they would understand. But there were no right words, only silence, and I had grown too familiar with it. At one point, I tried to write it all down. I found a notebook in the desk drawer, untouched for years, its pages crisp and blank. I wrote a single sentence. It wasn't supposed to happen. I stared at it for hours. The pen stayed in my hand, but no other words came. The ink dried on the tip, and I closed the notebook and slid it back into the drawer. Some nights I dreamed I was back in the car. The headlights cut through the dark like knives. The road stretched on forever, wet and glistening. I could hear the thud before it happened, the sound like a body falling from a great height. I would wake in a sweat, my breath ragged, my fingers clawing at the blankets. And then I would sit there, in the dark, waiting for my heart to calm, waiting for the silence to return. I didn't speak for days at a time. There was no one to speak to, no reason to form words. When I finally did hear my own voice, whispered to the hallway or muttered to a photo on the mantel, it sounded foreign, hollow, as though it belonged to someone else, someone thinner, more brittle, with less weight in the world. I had thought the worst part of guilt would be the memory, the moment, the blood and the shock and the fear. But it wasn't. It was the silence that came after, the way it lingered, the way it fed on the edges of everything, eating away at reason, at identity, at the sense of being someone worth saving. I started to avoid mirrors, not just for what I might see, but for what I might not. My eyes no longer held recognition. I had become a stranger wearing a mask made of my own skin. I dressed in the same clothes every day, an old sweatshirt and leggings, soft from wear and smelling faintly of bleach. I didn't shower often. I didn't care. Outside, life continued. The seasons inched forward. Leaves began to curl at the edges, then fall, then turn to mush beneath the wheels of passing cars. Rain came more often, soft at first, then heavier. I watched the rivulets streak down the glass like tears I couldn't summon. Eventually, I began to talk to her, not out loud, but in my head. In the kitchen, as I stirred soup I wouldn't eat. In the hallway, as I passed by the coat rack with the jacket she never retrieved. In the garage, standing in front of the dented car, breathing in the smell of regret. I told her I was sorry. I told her I hadn't meant it, that I was scared, that I panicked, that I froze, that I left, not because I didn't care, but because I didn't know how to stay. I imagined her listening. I imagined her forgiving me. I imagined her turning away. One evening, I opened the window for the first time in weeks. The air was cold. It smelled like wood smoke and wet leaves. I stood there, barefoot on the tile, the breeze cutting through me like glass. And for a brief moment, I thought I heard something, a voice maybe, or a sigh. But it was only the wind, only the silence, still with me, still patient, still waiting. It started with a knock, not the kind you expect, not the polite tap of a neighbor or the hurried rattle of a delivery. It was deliberate, measured, heavy, the kind of knock that doesn't wait for permission, that already knows the door will open. I stood frozen in the hallway, my hands damp and shaking, heart suddenly thunderous against my ribs. I didn't remember walking to the door. I didn't remember unlocking it, but I did. And they were there, two officers, one older, one young, their uniforms stiff, their faces unreadable. They said my name. I nodded. They asked if I would come with them. I didn't ask why. I didn't ask how they found me. I didn't speak at all. I walked with them down the steps and into the back seat of a patrol car that smelled of vinyl and tired air. My fingers trembled in my lap, nails digging into the soft skin of my palm, grounding me. The ride to the station was quiet. The city outside moved as if nothing had changed, as if no one had died on a wet street weeks earlier. We passed a school bus, a florist shop, a mother holding her toddler's hand at a crosswalk. I wanted to scream. I wanted to disappear. They led me through steel doors into a building that buzzed with fluorescent light and paper forms. They took my fingerprints. They took my photograph. They took my belongings and placed them into a bag marked with my name in block letters. They asked me questions. I answered them all. I told them what happened, every detail. I didn't try to lie. I didn't ask for a lawyer. I didn't ask for mercy. I told them I had been afraid, that I hadn't known what to do, that I left, and that I regretted it every moment since. Eventually, a public defender was assigned to me. Her name was Marla, and she looked tired the moment she stepped into the interview room. She wore a blazer too big for her frame and carried a file that already seemed too thin. She listened as I repeated the story. She made notes, nodding slowly, occasionally pressing her pen to her lips in thought. She didn't promise anything. She just said, "We'll try." The court hearings began quickly. First was the arraignment, then the pretrial motions, then the long stretch of waiting. My case moved through the system like water through a cracked pipe, unevenly, uncontrollably, always under pressure. I spent those weeks in a holding cell with a view of nothing but a gray wall and a vent that coughed dust into the air. I tried to read, but the words blurred. I tried to sleep, but the noise never stopped. There was always someone crying, or coughing, or screaming. Sometimes I couldn't tell if the sounds came from outside or from inside me. When the trial began, I was brought into the courtroom through a side door. My ankles were shackled, my wrists cuffed. I shuffled behind the bailiff like a broken thing. The courtroom was colder than I expected, the benches polished, the judge high above me in a chair that made him look more statue than man. The prosecutor wore a navy suit and a voice filled with certainty. He looked at me like I was a case file, a checklist, a problem to be resolved. Marla sat beside me, her file open, her fingers drumming lightly against the table. She leaned over once and whispered something I didn't hear. My ears were filled with the sound of my own breathing, my heartbeat, the clock ticking just above the judge's bench. I didn't look at the gallery behind me. I didn't want to see the faces of the people I had hurt. I didn't want to know if they were crying or if they were staring at me with hate. I didn't think I could survive either. The evidence was simple, straightforward. The car damage, the footage from a nearby security camera, the eyewitness who heard the impact and saw a vehicle speeding away. My confession, my silence in the days that followed. They laid it all out, clean and methodical, like surgery. The prosecutor described Sandra's last moments with such detail, it felt like a knife carving through me. I flinched when he said her name. I held my breath when he showed a photograph of the scene. Just the street, the groceries, the lone shoe in the gutter. Marla spoke too. She painted a different picture. A woman who panicked, who froze, who wasn't a danger to society, who had never broken a law before, who came forward, who confessed. She talked about trauma, about human instinct, about fear. She talked about me like I was still a person. I wasn't sure I believed her. They let me speak, not because they had to, but because it was part of the process. I stood slowly, my hands clenched into fists to stop them from shaking. My throat felt tight, my tongue dry. I looked down at the table. I couldn't look at the jury. I spoke softly. I told them I was sorry, that I had made the worst mistake of my life, that no apology could ever fix what I had done. I didn't cry. My tears had dried long ago. I just stood there, trying to keep from collapsing under the weight of my own voice. The jury deliberated for 5 hours. I spent that time in a small room behind the courtroom, staring at the cinder block walls. I imagined the world outside, the sky, the leaves, the sound of wind. I closed my eyes and tried to picture Sandra's face again, but all I could see were headlights. When they called me back, the room was silent. The judge asked me to rise. I stood. The foreperson read the verdict. Guilty. My knees almost gave out. The sentence was read without fanfare. Years, numbers, words I barely understood. Time translated into concrete, into metal, into the loss of everything I had once held as mine. I was led away in handcuffs. The bailiff's grip was firm but not cruel. As the courtroom faded behind me, I thought I heard someone sob. I thought it might be Marla, or Sandra's mother, or maybe it was me. In the hallway, my legs moved on their own. I followed the footsteps in front of me, the corridor stretching like a tunnel into a future I couldn't see. No one said my name. No one looked me in the eye. It was over, but nothing was over. The trial had ended. The sentence had begun. I had heard people say that prison changes you, that time stretches differently behind bars, that silence grows heavier, that the walls become mirrors. But they never warned me that the real punishment doesn't begin with the clang of the cell door or the orange jumpsuit. It begins when the noise of the world fades and you are left alone with your thoughts, with everything you didn't say, with everything you should have done. I was assigned to a unit on the north side of the facility, a long rectangular building painted in tired beige, flanked by wire fences that hummed like angry insects whenever the wind pressed through them. The windows were narrow, too high to look through, and covered in layers of grime that dulled the sun into a vague suggestion. My cell was on the second tier, number 2018. The door groaned when it opened, like something waking from an old pain. The walls were scuffed and streaked with faint shadows of former lives. The bed was a metal slab with a thin mattress that curled at the edges. The toilet sat in the corner like a forgotten warning. The air smelled of disinfectant and dust, a stale scent that clung to my skin no matter how many times I washed my hands. I tried to arrange my few possessions, toothbrush, paper cup, Bible with creased pages, but nothing stayed in place. Every morning, the vibrations of slamming doors and shouting guards rattled everything out of order. I stopped trying to make things neat. I stopped making my bed. The other women watched me at first, quietly, from the corners of the yard, from the end of the cafeteria line. Some looked away when I met their gaze. Others stared longer than they should have. I didn't know what they saw in me. Weakness, maybe, or regret. Maybe they were just waiting to see whether I'd crack. I kept to myself, ate my food in silence, walked in silence, slept when I could, which was rarely. At night, I lay on my back and watched the faint light from the corridor paint soft lines across the ceiling. I counted every breath, every heartbeat, like they were the only things I could still control. Time didn't move forward. It circled around me, dragged me back into the moment everything changed. The image of the headlights haunted me. They came in flashes, white, blinding, sudden. Sometimes I would hear the sound of the impact again, even though it hadn't made much noise at all. Just a thud, a soft, final sound. But in my head, it became thunder. I'd wake up gasping, nails dug into my palms, my body locked in a silent scream. The nightmares didn't show me blood. They didn't need to. The absence was worse. The space where she used to be, the cold air rushing in to fill it. The worst moments weren't the ones filled with noise. They were the quiet ones. Sitting on the edge of the bed after count, waiting in the corridor during shift change, hearing someone down the hall crying and not knowing whether it was grief or rage or both. That was when the weight of what I had done pressed down on me hardest. I started writing letters I never sent, pages and pages, to Sandra's family, to the people I worked with, to my mother, to no one. I wrote the same words over and over, searching for something honest, something that might explain what I couldn't even explain to myself. The truth was, I didn't know why I had run, why I hadn't called, why I thought I could make it disappear. I only knew that in that moment, fear had wrapped itself around my ribs like a serpent and squeezed until all I could do was move. Not forward, just away. The letters piled up. I tore them into strips and flushed them down the toilet. It felt right, like confession with no absolution. I attended the therapy group once a week, sat in a circle of metal chairs under flickering lights. Women spoke of violence, of betrayal, of numbness so deep they couldn't remember what warmth felt like. I listened, nodded, occasionally said something when pressed, but I kept my story tucked inside like a shard of glass, too dangerous to pass around, too sharp to ignore. One woman, Lorraine, spoke often. She had a voice like gravel and eyes that didn't blink enough. She talked about the day she forgave herself, how it took 17 years, how it didn't make the pain go away, but made the silence quieter. I didn't know if I believed her, but I wanted to. I tried to find small rituals, ways to hold on to some version of myself. I swept the floor of the unit every morning before breakfast. I folded my blanket the same way each night. I drank my tea slowly, counting the seconds between each sip. These were the borders I drew around my guilt, trying to keep it from swallowing me whole. Once, I caught my reflection in the metal surface of the sink. I barely recognized the woman staring back. The lines around her mouth, the hollows under her eyes. There was no glamour left, no mask, just the truth of who I was. And maybe, somewhere buried in that face, who I could still become. They offered me a job in the library. I accepted. It was quiet there, with the soft hum of overhead lights and the faint rustle of turning pages. I shelved books, repaired bindings, learned the rhythm of the catalog system. The other women left me alone mostly. I began to read again, novels, poetry, history, anything that reminded me the world still existed outside these walls. One afternoon, I found a note tucked inside a book of essays. No name, just one sentence, scrawled in pencil on a torn scrap of paper. "You're not the worst thing you ever did." I stared at it for a long time. My hands shook. My throat tightened. I slipped it into my pocket and never spoke of it to anyone. It became a kind of anchor, even if I didn't believe it yet. I spent the months counting things. The number of steps from my cell to the yard, the number of books on each shelf, the number of days since I had last heard a kind word. I wasn't waiting for release. I wasn't even sure I deserved one, but I was waiting for something to shift inside me, some small sliver of light to pierce the fog. Not forgiveness, not redemption, just a breath that didn't feel like drowning. I wasn't there yet, but I hadn't stopped breathing. The day they opened the gate for me, The world outside looked smaller than I remembered, as if the sky had dropped a little lower, pressing down on the streets and rooftops. My feet felt foreign on pavement without boundaries. I stood still for a long time, holding the small plastic bag with my belongings like it might disappear if I moved too fast. Inside were the same clothes I wore the night they took me away, washed, folded, and now a size too tight. A worn sweater, jeans with softened seams, and shoes that had forgotten the shape of my steps. I put them on anyway. I needed to feel the weight of who I had been before everything collapsed. There was no one waiting for me, no one to hand me flowers or wrap me in a coat or call out my name like they'd missed saying it. Just the wind and the low hum of cars on the highway beyond the fence. I walked toward the bus stop because I didn't know where else to go. My body moved like it had memorized this rhythm, even if my mind hadn't caught up. I sat on the bench, clutching the paper voucher they'd given me, and watched the trees across the street. Their branches moved like slow dancers, and I wondered how many seasons they had changed while I counted time through bars. I rode the bus for hours, not because it took that long to get somewhere, but because I didn't want to get anywhere too quickly. Every stop felt like a possible ending, a place I could step into and start over. But each time the door hissed open, I stayed put. I watched people get on, get off, carry groceries, listen to music, hold the hands of children. They were living. I was still learning how. Eventually, I got off near the shelter. A woman at the re-entry program had given me the address a few months before, circled it in blue pen, and said I could stay there for a while. The building was old but clean, a squat rectangle of brick with narrow windows and a crooked sign that said, "Welcome home." The irony hit me like cold water. I signed the form with a hand that trembled and was shown to a small room with a twin bed, a desk, and a laminated list of rules pinned to the wall. I sat on the mattress and stared at the ceiling, unsure if I felt safe or just empty. The first night I couldn't sleep. The silence in the room was too wide, too uncontrolled. In prison, silence was predictable. It came in waves, pressed against the edges of routine. But here, it sprawled in all directions, filled with echoes and possibilities I wasn't ready to hold. I listened to the faint sounds of others, footsteps, a cough, a television muttering through the wall. I curled under the blanket fully clothed, as if undressing might make me too vulnerable to the unfamiliar quiet. In the mornings, I wandered the nearby streets. I memorized the layout of the neighborhood like a new language. A bakery with windows fogged by sugar. A laundromat that smelled of steam and detergent. A park where dogs chased shadows and children screamed without consequence. I watched everything with a strange sense of detachment, as though the world had moved on without me, and now I was a ghost watching it from the other side of glass. At the shelter, they gave us chores. I offered to sweep the floors, wipe the tables, organize the pantry. My hands needed something to do. They still remembered the motion of cleaning, the comfort of small, repeatable tasks. One morning, I found a crooked jar of sugar in the kitchen, and I fixed its label. That act, simple and unnoticed, brought a strange calm. I realized I had missed order, even the kind no one thanked you for. Eventually, I began attending a support group at the community center. We sat in folding chairs in a circle, surrounded by posters that said things like, "You matter and healing takes time." Most days I didn't speak. I just listened. Stories poured out like warm rain, mistakes, losses, years stolen or thrown away. I sat still, absorbing each word like it might help rebuild something inside me. One afternoon, an older man named Ellis shared how he'd spent 5 years avoiding his own reflection, not because of what he saw, but because of what he didn't. I understood that too well. That night, I looked in the mirror for a long time. My hair had grayed unevenly. My eyes looked deeper set, but something softer lingered at the edges of my face, like a question I hadn't asked yet. I started volunteering at the public library 3 days a week. I shelved books, helped patrons log into the computer system, and eventually took over the returns desk. The library was quiet in the way I could bear, structured quiet, filled with pages turning and the occasional murmur. Children came in after school, dropping backpacks and asking for help with homework. One girl, maybe 8 or 9, handed me a torn picture book and asked if I could fix it. I said I'd try. That night, I carefully glued the pages back together, smoothing each crease with fingers that still remembered how to mend. Sometimes I wrote, not letters this time, but small reflections, fragments of memory, pieces of thought I couldn't say aloud. I wrote about the smell of snow, the way guilt sits heavier at night, the sound of leaves scraping the pavement. I didn't write to be read. I wrote to understand myself again, to find the person buried beneath the weight of what I'd done. I didn't visit Sandra's grave, not yet. I wasn't ready, but I passed the cemetery on my walks sometimes. I'd stop across the street, close enough to see the stones lined like teeth against the earth. I imagined her there, still, quiet, untouched by time. I whispered her name in my head and hoped she heard it somewhere. Forgiveness never came like a flood. It arrived in particles, in the way I began to sleep without waking in panic, in the way I helped a stranger find the bus route home, in the way I said my own name to the librarian and didn't flinch. I couldn't erase the silence that had followed that night, but I could try to live beyond it. One evening, the sky turned the color of worn denim, and the air smelled like cut grass and rain on metal. I stood outside the shelter and breathed in slowly. For the first time in years, the silence inside me didn't feel like a prison. It felt like a clearing, a quiet space where something new might grow. I didn't know what came next, but for the first time, I wanted to find out.